So how did I find my first project, ultimately make $140,000, even though I had never done it before and had no idea what I was doing, and how can you do it as well? Well, to tell you that, I first need to tell you a little bit of a story, which is the story of the amateur developer, the slippery politician, and the neighbor from hell. So the amateur developer had been to a bunch of courses, read a bunch of books, and had actually started talking to some people that knew what they were talking about. But he had really just missed out on making some big stuff ups by buying the wrong properties when he had no idea what he was doing. As an example, he almost bought this property with the idea of raising it so that it got city views to, in theory, raise the value of the property, even though he had no idea what that was going to cost and no idea how much value that was going to add to the property. Thank God he didn't have the guts to go through with it, because it would have been a big, bloody mistake. So fortunately, after that, he started talking to some people that actually knew what they were doing, and he got a rough idea about what the numbers were for doing a land subdivision. So what he did do well was he targeted 3 suburbs. He'd heard that enough, and he actually started doing that. So he targeted 3 suburbs. He started going to all the open homes that were there. He started building relationships with agents. He started making multiple phone calls every single day, calling agents, building that relationship, and making clear what he wanted. Now, let's be clear, he didn't really know what he wanted. He thought he knew what he wanted. So he sounded like a bit of a bumbling idiot. He really hated picking up the phone. He was really nervous about it, and he constantly made mistakes and constantly sounded like a fool. Even though he felt a bit sick in the gut doing it, he kept picking up the phone and kept making the phone calls. About 6 to 8 months later, he gets a phone call from an agent saying, "Hey, I think I've got what you want. Come and meet me on this site." The agent gives him the address. He goes and meets them on site. He has a look around. He knows enough, or at least he thinks he knows enough, to think this is a good deal. Because he knew that, he could start negotiating while on site. He got the agent to get the vendor on site. The vendor started negotiating, and they came to an agreement on a price. It was below market value. The property was off market. The seller, the vendor, was motivated. These were the things that worked in his favour. And the key thing was, from the road, no one really could see the opportunity that existed until you walked on the property. So why was the vendor motivated, and why was the amateur developer able to pick up the site below market value? The vendor needed a quick sale. They'd made commitments elsewhere, they needed the money fast, and the money coming fast was more important to them than getting the top dollar. So because of that, the amateur developer was able to get a discount on the price and buy it below market value. So he locked it down there and then. He did not even leave the site. He was able to act quickly because he at least thought he knew what he needed, and he knew the numbers. The amateur developer happened to be getting married in about 3 weeks' time, so he went home and caused a whole lot of stress to his soon-to-be wife, going, "Hey, we bought a property, we're settling a few weeks after we get married." You can imagine how well that went down. What he did do well was he called the town planner and said, "Hey, what can we do here? Can we subdivide this site?" The town planner said, "Yes, we think we can. It's an impact accessible development." Knowing what I know now, I would have suggested to that amateur developer not to proceed at that particular point in time, because an impact accessible development definitely is not a sure thing. It does mean that the public gets to have a say about what happens with that site, and they can just be flat out rejected if there's enough uproar from the public. The amateur developer didn't realise that at the time, so went ahead blindly. Thank God it worked out. The next thing that the amateur developer did horribly was they didn't call the engineer. Now, if you're going to do any kind of development, you definitely want to talk to an engineer. After finance was approved and after the amateur developer had gone unconditional, he called an engineer. And the engineer almost fell off the chair when they said, "Hey, I've gone unconditional, can you have a look at this site? What do we need to do?" Very luckily, the engineer came back with good news, and the site was able to be subdivided. Now, that there is a crucial part, because there are a lot of sites out there that in theory can be developed, but physically cannot be developed based on the infrastructure that is there. The amateur developer had absolutely no idea about that, and at the time didn't have a mentor to be able to tell him that that was a crucial part of the puzzle. That was only luck that it turned out okay. That could have been a site that completely stopped the amateur developer's career. So at this point, the amateur developer was in, and they were absolutely overwhelmed because they were looking at what can they do with this site. Should they demolish the house and create 2 side-by-side blocks? Should they create a battle axe block, which is a driveway down the side and a block at the back, and renovate the house? Should they raise the house? Should they do a huge renovation and extension on the house? There was all of these questions which were all going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the amateur developer was panicking. It was, thank God, at this point that they realised that they should get a mentor, and that's what they did. Now, a key takeaway here with the mentor part is the mentor that they thought they wanted was presenting in a completely different part of the country in a couple of weeks' time. Now, the amateur developer flew there specifically to meet that mentor. And when she spoke to them, and when the mentor found out that they had flown all that way just to come and see them, that had them take that amateur developer seriously. There's a key takeaway, is be unreasonable. Do something that's going to have the mentor you want take notice of you. Otherwise, you are just another person in the crowd. So thank God the amateur developer got a mentor on their side at that point. Now, that didn't mean it was smooth sailing from there. It was certainly a bumpy ride, but the mentor was at least there now to stop the amateur developer doing any other stupid things like going unconditional on sites that were impact accessible and without checking with an engineer first, which could have been catastrophic problems. So working with that mentor, it was quickly decided that it was going to be a battle axe block and renovate the house. That was the most cost-effective option and the fastest option, the way to get in, get out, get paid. Had the amateur developer done any subdivisions in the past? No. Had they done renos in the past? No. But they were now surrounded by people that actually had done that in the past, and they could talk to those people and pull from those people's knowledge, and that helped tremendously. Now, enter the neighbour from hell. So one of the big opportunities with this property was the fact that you couldn't see from the road where the opportunity was. You have a look at this photo, you can see that it just looked like a house on a relatively narrow block. What you can't see from there is there is about 7 to 8 metres between the fence and the house because it is so overgrown. There were so many trees and shrubs that were just on the side there, you couldn't really tell where the boundary was. No one could tell from the road that there was enough space down the side for a driveway and enough land at the back for an extra block. So then we decided to clear all the stuff on the side. Now at this point I hadn't met any of the neighbours, and I thought that this was going to be a really good thing and the neighbours would be really excited to come home and find this property cleaned up because it was a bit dirty and it had got beyond the previous owner. So we make a working bee. I go over there with my brother, my father, some friends, and we start chopping down the trees, our trees that are on our side of the fence, and all of the shrubs and all the mess, and we're cleaning it up. Then the neighbour comes home and I walk over all happy and excited and expecting to have a great meeting because I'm thinking they'd be really grateful for the fact that we've cleaned up all this mess. Holy mackerel, was I wrong. She was not happy at all. She went off the rails because she loved the privacy that all that gave her. Now, even though they were ours, she was talking to us as though we had got rid of some of her stuff, which was absolutely not the case. But what the amateur developer hadn't done there is form a relationship before actually starting work. That was a key learning for the amateur developer. Now, with this particular person, I actually don't think it was going to make a difference. It seemed pretty clear that from the outset, she really just wanted anything to complain about and wanted something to focus her negative energy on. There's not a whole lot you can do for those people. So that was the beginning of a lovely, lovely relationship with that neighbour. Moving forward, everything that was done on site, the neighbour was on the phone to council. Every time a person started on site, apparently they were doing something illegal. Every time it rained, apparently the developer was flooding her block. It didn't matter what was done on site, it was wrong and she was going to call someone and tell them about it. So the developer was getting very regular calls from council asking, what have you done here, what have you done there, etc, etc, etc. Now the cool part about this was it got that consistent that eventually the council caught on to what was going on, because every time they came to check out the complaint, there was no fault. And then they realised where the problem sat, and they actually turned on the neighbour, and it started becoming a case of the council calling the developer, giving them a heads up as to what she was up to, and they even started pointing out to her a few things that she'd done to her property that was illegal. Now, you would think that that would have shut her up at that point, but it actually didn't. She just went above the council members and went straight to the politicians. So one day, the amateur developer gets a call from the slippery politician. The slippery politician didn't call and say, hi, I'm a slippery politician. The slippery politician called and pretended to be a friend, pretending to be someone that cared about the amateur developer and was really looking out for them, wanting to make sure that everything went well for them, and really wished that the amateur developer would have called them before they started this development, and etc, etc, etc. The whole thing was done as, I'm trying to help you. But it didn't feel right for the amateur developer. Something felt a bit off. So as soon as he got off the phone from this very passive-aggressive phone call from the slippery politician, he called his town planner and explained what had happened and explained what had been said. Now, the slippery politician had suggested that the amateur developer, for his own good, call a particular person in council. The town planner pointed out that that would be probably the worst possible thing that could be done, because that would be the last person that they would want to bring attention to. Now, this was just the start of the slippery politician's work. You can imagine how much sleep the amateur developer was getting. This wasn't particularly fun. Now, other stuff-ups that the amateur developer made on this particular project was they were on the tools. They were trying to save money by doing work themselves. There was one particular day where they were literally wheelbarrowing dirt uphill, and a bit of a penny drop there, because what could have taken an earth-moving machine about half an hour's work took the amateur developer literally a day's work going up and down a hill with a wheelbarrow, only to be washed down the following day when there was 1 in 200 year rainfall. Now this was another learning. Silt fences are your best friend because you know whose yard all of that dirt ended up in. It was the neighbour from hell's yard. Now it was interesting how when the amateur developer offered to go over and clean it all up, that all of a sudden she became very friendly. As soon as the amateur developer went back on the other side of the fence and the mess was cleaned up, the friendliness stopped. So the project continued, the renovations continued, the amateur developer hired all sorts of people that were terrible at their jobs, lots of learnings. Again, really good to have people around you that actually know what they're doing so that you can find out who they're using and who they recommend, because that can save you a lot of time. And the secret here is too that the cheapest person is not the best person, never is the best person, and there is always a price to pay. It's just a question of how the price is going to be paid. Now, eventually the application actually got approved by council, but the slippery politician had call-up powers, and so he had it called up in front of the council to be voted on. I'd say at this point he expected the amateur developer, being a newbie, to fold and just walk away. But that was not what the amateur developer decided to do. He decided to go and present to council, which was his right. And it was interesting how when it became public and the manipulation of the councillor became obvious, that he seemed to bow out very, very quickly and became very friendly very quickly again. And it was voted through and approved unanimously, because even the council members turned up to that meeting and spoke in favour of the development, because it was very clear that the slippery politician was basically being slippery. And what was later found out was the reason he was so interested in it was the neighbours across the road that didn't like the development were friends of his. Interestingly, that politician lived in that same area, and his street was the best maintained street by council in the entire area. So I don't know that we can necessarily trust the ethical standards of this particular politician. So key questions out of this is, what would have happened if the impact assessable application was rejected? Well, the amateur developer would have been in a lot of trouble. So impact assessable developments and understanding what is possible with a site before going unconditional are crucial. What would have happened if the engineers came back with bad news? Same thing. The amateur developer would have been stuffed, to be blunt. So make sure you do those sorts of things before you go unconditional on sites. Third, numbers. If the amateur developer had bought that project beforehand where he was going to raise it and do all sorts of stuff that he had no idea about what he was doing, that could have also spelt the end of his career before he even got started. So know your numbers and have your money rules in place to make sure that you only go ahead with sites that are actually going to work out. So other positive things that the amateur developer did in this particular one was they moved into it and they lived there for about 12 months. So it became a tax-free sale when they sold it, which increased the profit and the bottom line. Not doable for everyone, but in their particular circumstances at the time, it worked out perfectly. Another key fail that this person made was they thought they could trust someone just because they knew them. So this was the contractor that was doing the demolition. And he suggested it would be done much cheaper if it was done by the hour rather than a fixed price. So that's what the amateur developer did. Now, at the time, he had no idea that he was potentially getting ripped off. However, he had this same contractor back at the following job who suggested the same thing. But this time the amateur developer got multiple quotes. And what the friend had suggested it might cost was about $20,000. All of the other quotes came in at about $11,000. And it was interesting how when the friend was told this, all of a sudden he dropped his number to $11,000. That friend did not get the job and he no longer gets phone calls for any work. So ultimately, what had this actually work out for the amateur developer? Well, definitely a bit of luck at the start because of those checks that weren't done. But then second to that was he had a good team. And key, he bought well. One of the things here is if you buy well, it can forgive a lot of sins. If you buy poorly, you're kind of stuffed from the start, or at least very much under pressure. So buying well, you make your money when you buy, is absolutely crucial. And the other thing is an attitudinal thing, which is just being willing to give it a go. Being willing to look like a fool from time to time, being willing to let people know you actually don't know what you're talking about, and being willing to make a lot of mistakes. The amateur developer was still working full-time at this point in time, so this was being done as a side hustle, and it was causing a lot of stress because he did not know what he was doing, but he kept going forward, and the second one got easier, and the third one got even easier. So, in summary, what were the stuff-ups? Not doing appropriate checks before going unconditional, being on the tools, not getting multiple quotes, hiring cheap trades, not building relationships with neighbours. What was done well? Had a good team in place, bought well, was willing to give it a go. So you can see here, anyone can do this. You just need to put in the time and put in the effort to make sure you buy well, get a good team around you, and be willing to give it a go. And hopefully you avoid the neighbours from hell and the politicians from hell. But I can't promise that. I hope you enjoyed that. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments. Please subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos, because next comes the third deal, where we managed to develop the property and sell the land without ever having to buy it. That was pretty awesome. Thanks again, and talk to you soon.